Hello, and thank you very much for having me. I'm going to be talking about extreme weather events and how people view democracies, more political economy. In general, after a natural disaster, the way the government responds to that disaster is very important in shaping citizens' views of their government. Right? So there is this interaction between a government and its citizens that is important to understand when we're thinking about political economy consequences of natural disasters. The way research is usually looked at this is by looking at how natural disasters affect voting outcomes. What we know very little about is how natural disasters affect more broad political beliefs. Specifically, at least to my knowledge, we have absolutely no idea how disasters affect people's views of democracy or kind of their support of the wider system that we are in. Why might this matter? Well, the government who is responding to the natural disaster is of course constrained by the system they're in, right? So a politician in a democracy has different means or different abilities than a politician in an autocracy or a straight up dictator. And so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to look at whether or not weather shocks, so I'm going to look at floods or droughts in Africa and a bunch of sub-Saharan African countries do affect people's support for democracy. I'm going to give you the precise definition of the question in a bit. So maybe at first hand, it's not obvious, or at least to me, it was not obvious why we would expect an effect at all, right? If I'm not happy with how my politician is dealing with a disaster, I might just vote for someone else and finish, end of the story. We don't need this paper. So it turns out I am going to hopefully convince you that there is an effect. And given that there is this, it's very important to think about what could be the mechanisms that are driving this. Yeah? The slight complication here is that if you really sit down and start thinking about these mechanisms, there are many, and really many. I'm going to talk about two today. So one is what I call this perception of a climate change story, which is in some way linked to the paper that we just saw. This idea that these shocks might on the one hand serve as some kind of information treatment that people are going to update their beliefs about climate change, but also it's an information about how the government is fighting climate change, right? And we just saw in the paper before that people do seem to care about climate change. On the other hand, maybe the kind of classical econ story, there is a huge literature, especially in developing countries, that shows us there's huge economic damages from these climate shocks. Right? So it affects agricultural output, it affects health, violence, and so forth. And so you might think, if I'm a very small scale farmer, you know, my crops are gone because of a flood, I'm just angry at the government, I want the government to basically reimburse me or give me a cash transfer to get over this flood. Of course, you might think there's an interaction between the two. I could be a small scale farmer, want help from the government, and simultaneously also care about climate change, but that doesn't have to be this interaction. Okay. To add another layer of complexity to this whole thing, might be that there are different mechanisms at play for different types of shocks. Yeah. And so I think theoretically, even though today there's nothing in theory that I'm going to do, nothing theoretical that I'm going to do, it's this interaction between the government, right? There's this political agency model that's going on in the background, but the precise mechanisms are going to really kind of have different theoretical implications, which is quite interesting to think about. Okay, the data that I'm using, just very quickly, do not waste too much time on this. The main data is these political surveys, the Afrobarometer surveys from Africa. These are surveys across all of Africa. I got the geolocalized version of them, so I know where these people live. I use rounds 2 to 6, which is from 2002 to 2015. And I'm for now using 16 sub-Saharan African countries. The precise question, the outcome that we're going to look at today is exactly how it's phrased up there, which says which of these three statements is closest to your opinion? 1, democracy is the best. 2, sometimes non-democratic governments can be preferable. 3, for someone like me, it doesn't matter what kind of government we have. I'm going to turn this into a dummy variable that's equal to 1 if democracy is the best. Okay? So basically, support democracy, they're equal to 1. I'm going to merge these individuals to the weather that they're exposed to by using this reanalysis data set, which gives me very precise geolocalized daily weather, precipitation, and temperature data sets. Yeah, I'm going to aggregate this to different levels, but today I'm going to define flood as being rainfall as being more than 2 standard deviation above average rainfall over time in that specific location, and a drought is defined symmetrically. Okay, empirically, the way you might think about identifying this effect, there are different ways in which one can go about this. It turns out they all give me the same conclusion. I'm going to go with one that I think is relatively intuitive, but keep in mind it gives me a very short run effect when I'm looking at it. It doesn't really take into account long run or dynamic effects. What I'm going to do, basically, in some regions, so just think of one survey wave. In some regions, when enumerators go interview these individuals, they need more than 1 month to interview all people, just because the region can be bigger or because they need to interview many people there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at only these regions, and I'm going to compare individuals in these regions that were either interviewed after a disaster happens to the individuals that were interviewed before the disaster happened. Yeah. So you interview these people just pre and post of one specific disaster in a specific region, in a specific country, within a survey wave. Yeah. So to make this a bit more precise, you have an outcome of an individual I, region R, and survey wave T. Regress this on a dummy if you're treated or if you're interviewed after either a drought or a flood. I include a bunch of controls, so these are household controls, village controls, and even weather controls. So for the particular purposes of this coefficient, this doesn't matter. I include region times survey wave fixed effect. So this is going to make sure that we really identify each individual flood or drought. And I cluster standard errors at the region times survey wave level, and the whole regression is weighted by survey weights. Okay. One could do some balancing tests and control or pre-shock interviews people with the people after interviewed after the shock. Everything seems very balanced. One can go look how the Afrobarometer designs or interviews people. This is a relatively random path that they go, so it shouldn't interfere with any types of disasters. Okay, so here are the main results. The outcome is to support democracy, right? Which is the dummy variable that's equal to 1 if they do support democracy. What you see for droughts and for floods, negative coefficient. For droughts, not significant, so that's going to change shortly, so bear with me. For floods, negative and significant. So what does this tell me? This tells me if I'm exposed to a flood, my support to democracy decreases by about 5.7 percentage points. Yeah. Just to be very clear, the baseline support of democracy in the control group in the flood sample is about 70%, which we might already question how much they love democracy. Here it's a bit higher, it's like 75%. Yeah. But so from 70%, 70 roughly percent, there's a decrease of 5.7 percentage points. Okay. Now, let's go back to what we talked about in the beginning, and let's think about these possible mechanisms that might be at play. Yeah. The first one I said might be that people are taking these shocks as some sort of an information treatment, and they're updating about how the government is, about the importance of climate change, but also about how the government is fighting climate change. So one issue that I face is that the Afrobarometer, at least in the waves that are so far geolocalized, doesn't ask about climate change. But it does tell me things, whether these people are educated. It does tell me whether they regularly consume news. It does tell me whether they're actively involved with their kind of political life, whether they're interested or in contact with politicians. And so what I can do is I can look at heterogeneous effects with respect to these variables, for example. If I do this, and here I'm doing this for the droughts. So let's look at column 1, which is looking at the heterogeneity. So the outcome is still this supporting democracy. Column 1 is doing heterogeneity with respect to education. So the first coefficient is for the educated. Second is the effect for the non-educated. So educated means high school degree or more, right? These are sub-Saharan African countries. So what you now see, suddenly the effect of a drought for the educated individuals is to reduce their support of democracy by 10 percentage points. Suddenly this guy became significant. And for the non-educated guys, there is no significant effect. The significance didn't carry through to the overall table before, because the large share of the sample is just not educated. What you see is that this kind of carries through in the whole thing. The effect for droughts is driven by these people who are educated, who are in contact with politicians, and who are regularly consuming news. And so that seems to be, at least an indication for now, that droughts have this effect, and one mechanism, not the only one by all means, but one that is at play is one that is going through this thing that these shocks are acting as some sort of an information treatment and are telling these people maybe more about climate change, but also maybe about the fact that their government is not doing enough. So I don't have this table, but if I do the same for floods, it's much less clear. For floods, you still have these effects for basically the educated and upper class, but you also have basically negative coefficient and stars for the no categories. So for the more uneducated people. So what does that hint at? That hints at that for floods, sure, there's maybe also this channel, but there's possibly also another channel which is going more towards these economic impacts that we were talking about in the beginning. And so this second chart here is looking at heterogeneity for impacts for floods now. And here I've taken some heterogeneity variables that I've been finding the afterbarometer so far that hint at something like poverty. Yeah. So start in the back. You live in an area that doesn't have electricity. Are you working in a climate change affected job? Are you unemployed? Let's forget the first two columns very quickly. Right? You see that the overall negative significant effect of floods that we found is driven by people who are in more poverty. The reason I included the first two is because in general there seems to be this gradient between religion and poverty, and also men seem to work more in agriculture. Right? And so you have that this again seems to be driving this as well. Okay. So let me conclude. It seems to be the case that weather shocks or these disasters seem to be predictors of people's support in democracy. That seems to be a relatively important thing if you think about the fact that climate change and maybe this erosion of democracy throughout the world are two of, let's call them two very important factors or two very important issues that we are facing today. It also seems to be that the mechanisms that could explain these effects might differ for different types of shocks. So for droughts, at least the suggested or kind of beginning findings, suggested findings that I have so far seem to suggest that we're in this perception type story where people are the more upper class. They might not be directly affected by the climate change itself, but they care about climate change and they want their government to act. And when the government maybe doesn't, they lose faith in democracy. For floods, it's a more mixed story where you have this channel, but you have also this channel that maybe floods are just a bit more visible to people and they're directly affected themselves. I think there's a lot more to be done on this front. The other thing just to keep in mind, I've shown very short-term effects, but look at more dynamic things, right?
I'm convinced there's just a cable under the floor that's
okay, anyway, now look at more dynamic effects. They do after 1 year they're still there, but they do fade out after and they diminish in magnitude. Right, so after 1 year it's no longer a 10 percentage point decrease. But so they do remain for a while. And so I think a very important question is also kind of like the cumulative impacts over a person's lifetime, which I think is something to look at in the future. Thank you very much.